Hello everyone and welcome to lesson 12.2A. I've entitled this video, The Trail of Tears. This video is going to cover pages 330 to 333. Removing Native Americans. As the nation expanded west, many Native Americans still remained in the east. The Cherokee, Creek, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw peoples lived in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida. These groups had created successful farming communities that were much like many other American communities. As a result, Americans considered them, quote, civilized, and referred to them as the 5 civilized tribes. Though Americans recognized the success of the 5 civilized tribes, they did not necessarily respect their rights. In fact, some white people wanted the Native Americans' lands for themselves. To make this possible, they wanted the federal government to force eastern Native Americans to relocate to lands west of the Mississippi River. Andrew Jackson supported the white settlers' demand for Native American land. He had once fought the Creek and Seminole in Georgia and Florida to give the settlers more land. When he became president in 1829, he stated that he wanted to move all Native Americans to the Great Plains. Many people believed this region to be a wasteland where American settlers would never want to live. Here we are here in Illinois. Many people thought that if all Native Americans moved there, conflict with them would be ended. Heard that story before. Question number 1. What were the names of the 5 Native American tribes that made up the 5 civilized tribes? They were the Cherokee, Creek, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw. Question 2. In which 4 states did the 5 civilized tribes live at that time? We'll take a look at this map and you can see that would be the states of Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida. Question 3. Why did Americans call these tribes civilized? Well, because they had taken on this kind of living that we did, which was farming, more of the traditional stay settled and farm the land that you live on, and so we called them civilized. Question 4. Why did many Americans want the federal government to force the Native Americans to move west of the Mississippi River? We've talked about this before. In many cases, it comes down to one thing: money. They wanted that land for themselves. They were greedy, and they realized if they could have that land instead of the Native Americans, they could make money raising some sort of crops on those lands, and so money. Question 5. What does the word relocate mean? It means to move people to a different location, or when people in general move to a different location. Question 6. What position did President Jackson take toward moving the Native Americans off of their lands? He was very much for it. He'd already had a history of this in his life before being president, and so nothing had changed. He still believed we would have future conflicts avoided if they would just go to the west of the Mississippi River and stay out of our way, and everything will be better. That was the idea. And question 7, why did President Jackson want to move the Native Americans to the Great Plains? Well, because it was land that he saw as not being very valuable, and so, hey, better them than us. And so that was kind of the mentality back then, which is move them to junkier land. And so that was the idea behind relocating the Native Americans west of the Mississippi River. The Cherokee versus Georgia. In 1830, President Jackson pushed the Indian Removal Act through Congress. This law allowed the federal government to pay Native Americans to move west. Jackson then sent officials to make treaties with the Native Americans in the Southeast. In 1834, Congress established the Indian Territory. Most of the region was located in what now is called the state of Oklahoma. This area was to be the new home for the Native Americans of the Southeast. Question number 8. What did the Indian Removal Act do? It was a law passed by Congress that would pay the Native Americans for their lands with the agreement that you're out of here. You're moving west, and we're going to set up a place for you called Indian Territory west of the Mississippi River, in a place that we now call, on question number 9, that is the current state of Oklahoma. Most eastern Native American peoples felt forced to sell their land and move west. The Cherokee refused to do so. In treaties of the 1790s, the federal government had recognized the Cherokee as a separate nation. However, the state of Georgia, in which many Cherokee lived, refused to accept the Cherokee status. In 1830, Georgia made Cherokee land part of the state. It also began to enforce state laws in the Cherokee Nation. As pressure for relocation mounted, the Cherokee appealed to the American people. Primary source appealed to the Cherokee Nation, 1830. We are aware that some persons suppose it will be for our advantage to remove beyond the Mississippi. Our people universally think otherwise. We wish to remain on the land of our fathers. Still, Georgia pressured the Cherokee. In response, the Cherokee turned to the United States Supreme Court. In Worcester v. Georgia, 1832, Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that Georgia had no right to interfere with the Cherokee. President Jackson, who supported Georgia's efforts to remove the Cherokee, declared that he would ignore the Supreme Court's ruling. Quote, "John Marshall has made his decision," Jackson is said to have declared. "Now let him enforce it." No one was willing or able to challenge the president's failure to enforce the court's ruling. Question number 10. Why did most Eastern Native Americans sell their land and move west? They felt forced. They felt like they had no other choice, or else they would be attacked and killed. And so they really didn't have a choice at all. Question number 11. Why did the Cherokee people refuse to relocate? Well, they refused to relocate because they had already signed a treaty with the United States recognizing them as a separate country. And so we had no right to force them off their lands. They are in their own country. Question 12. Why was the Supreme Court case of Worcester versus Georgia an important case in 1832? It was important because our Chief Justice John Marshall and the Supreme Court ruled that Georgia had no right to move the Cherokee people off of their lands in their own country. Question 13. How did President Jackson feel about Worcester versus Georgia? He was not impressed. He said, whatever. Yeah, John Marshall can rule that in the courts, but let's see what he can do about making me enforce it. So this was definitely a power play by President Jackson. The Trail of Tears. By 1835, the Cherokee were divided about what to do. That year, the federal government convinced a small number of Cherokee, about 500 of them, to sign the Treaty of New Echota. In this treaty, the group agreed to give up all Cherokee land by 1838. Question number 14. What did the Treaty of New Echota do? It was a treaty in which the Cherokee people agreed to give up their land by 1838. This was their, so to speak, death sentence to lose their land. And notice it was a small part of them, so America basically connived their way into getting what they wanted. Cherokee Chief John Ross, pictured here on the right, sent a protest to the United States Senate. Ross explained that the few Cherokee who signed the treaty did not speak for all the 17,000 Cherokee in the region. Many white Americans, including Senators Daniel Webster and Henry Clay, also opposed the treaty as unfair. However, their pleas did not change the minds of President Jackson or the white settlers. In 1836, the Senate approved the treaty by a single vote. Question number 15. What case did Cherokee Chief John Ross try to make to the United States Senate to protest the Treaty of New Echota? His point was, these 500 people do not speak for all of us, and so he pleaded with the Senate, this is not fair, this is not what we want as a people. But as you can see, his cries were to deaf ears. Question 16 is a thinking question. Why do you think the vote was so close in the Senate to approve the Treaty of New Echota? Well, remember, every state gets 2 senators, and at that time, because there was a pretty good balance in the Senate between northern states and southern states, you had the northern states that didn't want to see this happen. They didn't want to see another more expansion into the South, causing greater amounts of land to have perhaps more slave states. And so in the North, they were generally opposing this. And in the South, of course, they were definitely wanting this to happen. So a very close vote in the Senate, and it was approved by a single vote. When the treaty's 1838 deadline arrived, only about 2,000 Cherokee had moved west. Jackson's successor, President Martin Van Buren, ordered the army to move the rest of them. In May of 1838, General Winfield Scott, pictured here on the right, arrived in the Cherokee Nation with 7,000 troops to remove the remaining Cherokee by force. He told them that resistance and escape were hopeless. The Cherokee knew that fighting would lead to their destruction. Filled with sadness and anger, Cherokee leaders gave in. Between June and December of 1838, soldiers rounded up Cherokee in North Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee. Under guard, the Cherokee began their march to Indian Territory in the West. Question number 17. In 1838, what did President Martin Van Buren order General Winfield Scott to do? Round up the Cherokee Nation and force them by gunpoint to move west. The forced relocation of some 15,000 Cherokee was a terrible ordeal. Most people were not prepared for the journey. Trouble started even before they set out. As the Cherokee crowded into camps and awaited the command to begin their march, illness broke out. As many as 2,000 Cherokee died. Once on the trail, the Cherokee suffered from hunger and from exposure to the weather. These conditions led to the deaths of another 2,000 people. When the relocation was over, about 1/4 of the Cherokee population was dead. The Cherokee came to call their forced journey west the trail where they cried. Historians call it the Trail of Tears. Question number 18. How many Cherokee were forced to move? About 15,000. Question 19. What were some of the horrible things that happened during the forced relocation of the Cherokees? Well, number one, they suffered from disease or illness broke out in those crowded, cramped areas. Disease can spread quickly. They had to face the cold and the exposure to the weather, which means the cold. They also had hunger, and they weren't prepared for this trip. They weren't ready for the journey, and that led to more deaths, which leads us to question 20. What fraction of Cherokees died during the forced relocation? About 1/4. In question 21, due to the terrible ordeal of the relocation, we call this event the Trail of Tears. And here's a primary source I wanted to leave you with. This is from a different book that I found. This is from Memoirs of Private John G. Burnett, December 1890. On the morning of December 17th, we encountered a terrific sleet and snowstorm with freezing temperatures. And from that day until we reached the end of the fateful journey on March the 27th, 1839, the sufferings of the Cherokee were awful. The trail of the exiles was a trail of death. Well, thank you so much for watching. Before we go, I didn't want to leave you with a meme of the Trail of Tears. I didn't think that was appropriate, but I do think this political cartoon is certainly one that can make you think. The question is, are they here legally? I guess we'll just have to wait until they write the laws. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.